they fine? Oh, their question was?
Yes.
Yes.
And then it will be the same question.
Howdy.
It's not.
Howdy!
Woo! Oh, come on, guys.
Okay, so I'm going to start us off with some introductions. I'm Reagan Helsher. I'm representing Texas A&M Young Americans for Freedom. I am our current vice chairman, and I'm a senior here, graduating in a couple weeks with my animal science degree.
Hello, I'm Luis Peña. I'm the moderator for Aggie Dems, and I'm also the finance chair. I'm also a senior, so yeah. Thank you for coming tonight to tonight's debate. We really appreciate the turnout. We hope you walk away with a new perspective on things.
Now we're going to introduce each group.
Howdy, my name is Preston Phillips. I'm the chairman of Texas A&M Young Americans for Freedom. I'm studying industrial engineering, and I'm graduating in 2 weeks as well.
Howdy, my name is Houston. I'm, like Preston, I'm a senior or super senior chemical engineering major, and I'll be graduating in about 2 weeks here.
Howdy, my name is Carson Bethel. I'm an MICT major, I'm a junior, and I'm with YAS Campus Outreach Director.
Howdy, I'm Texas A&M's Vice President, Kevin Pierce, and the new incoming president of A&M. I'm a junior, or A&M of Texas Aggie Democrats. I am a nuclear engineering major.
Howdy, my name is Shashan Fernando. I am a member of Texas Aggie Dems. I'm a freshman, and I'm a political science major.
All right, and howdy y'all. My name is Zach Spanek. I'm a sophomore history and political science major. I'm currently the programs manager of Aggie Dems, but I'm the vice president-elect, so that's really exciting. And then we have one more person who's going to fill in for me because I have to leave halfway through.
Howdy, I'm Ivan. I am the programs elect with the Aggie Dems. I am also poli-sci, and I'm a super senior.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started with our first question. So this is a question from YAF to the Aggie Dems. What do you, as the Aggie Dems, think is a reasonable solution to the border crisis? Do you even think there is a crisis?
So we do think there is a crisis. I think it's pretty obvious that there is a border crisis. I think we probably disagree on exactly what the crisis is, but we agree on that. We need a safe and orderly, clear pathway to citizenship. And we need to make sure that it's not capped so tightly by congressional standards that make sure that we can't have these migrants coming in at the rate that they are. When we do that, we backlog migrants, and we make it so that obtaining green cards is a near impossibility. The immigration courts are drowning right now. We have, I think, the statistics say 685 total immigration judges that are dealing with about 4,500 cases each at a caseload of about 900 a year. That is impossible for them to get through at a reasonable time. So when you backlog that with more and more immigration, we're not going to get a solution that is any more effective than what we have right now. In order to solve this, we gotta fund these immigration courts. We have to make sure that the migrant receiving communities are communities that are being funded by federal money, because we wouldn't want to engage in the superficial kind of social analysis that looks at only the effects and not deals with the underlying causes. I'm sure none of us want that. We need to make sure these host communities and host countries, we give them the kind of support that they need.
To YAF, the Aggie Dems will ask the same question. What do you as a YAF think is a reasonable solution to the border crisis? And do you even think there is a crisis?
We do think that there is a crisis. We think that the number of immigrants coming through across the border is too much. Of course, I don't disagree with the fact that we do need better ways to handle those coming in, as far as facilitating those people that are coming here, granting the right amount of green cards, granting the right amount of asylum seekers. I do think a lot of it, though, is also messaging and rhetoric. Under the Trump years, migration was down. Today it's up, largely because of the rhetoric that if you come to this country, there's going to be no repercussions for coming illegally. There's going to be no quota to really stop that. So I think part of the immigration that is coming here is also just a relation to the fact that it's the administrative tone. And I think personally that the administrative tone needs to be a bit more resolved. Under the Trump years especially, there was also policies like Remain in Mexico, which processed people there rather than here, which also kept a lot of people from crossing the border illegally or dangerously, and other kinds of things. That's all.
Okay, now we are going to open the floor for rebuttals. So we'll start with the Aggie Dems.
Okay, so oops, apologize for that. I guess where we'll start with that, we'll start with like Remain in Mexico. Just because I feel like the biggest problem with that policy isn't necessarily that it did really anything to like impact the number of migrants coming through, because in order to go through the Remain in Mexico policy, you still have to cross into the U.S. or go through a legal point of entry, and then you would just get put back in Mexico. That's how, as far as I understand, that's how it worked. And that just presents a lot of dangers for migrants who are crossing over, because in most cases they're not exactly coming from Mexico already. They're coming from somewhere else in the world or somewhere else in Central America or Latin America. And so they've already made the journey there, and then to be sent back into Mexico where there is, higher crime rates and other sort of dangers that they can encounter. Things like coyotes who are bringing them, who maybe can exploit them to get them across the border, drug cartels, that sort of thing. So I think from the human side of it, that policy doesn't really help, and it doesn't really impact the number of migrants that are coming through. And the other thing to talk about, I think, is just the understanding of how the number of undocumented immigrants actually grow in the U.S. Because most of them are coming through in technically illegal means, which is they're going through legal ports of entry and seeking asylum, and then they just basically are told to either wait in the U.S. or with Remain in Mexico, wait in Mexico until it's time for their court appearances and that sort of thing. Remain in Mexico kind of makes that difficult, because if you are trying to get in contact with an immigration lawyer in the U.S. and you're in Mexico, obviously that can present a lot of difficulties there. And the other thing too is a lot of what happens of what makes someone become like an undocumented immigrant is they've entered legally, and then they've essentially missed their court date and now they're here illegally. Or if the other big one is going to be if they enter illegally with like a visa, like a work visa, and then that visa expires and they stay here, and that's where that happens. So I don't think, yes, there is going to be an issue with people crossing into the country from the southern border, but a lot of it too is just back focused on those systems put in place, the asylum system, and just the immigration system in general, and making sure those are strong enough to handle not only the people who are already here, but then also those people who are coming in. So.
And now, yeah, your discussion.
So, in regards to the Remain in Mexico policy, that is the Migrant Protection Protocols introduced by DHS. And as I forgot your name, Zach, as Zach mentioned, yes, it gives DHS the ability to, or it gave, because it's not the policy anymore, but it gave DHS the ability to send migrants back to Mexico while they awaited their hearing date or the court date. The reason for this was because when migrants were coming over, they were requesting asylum, and the catch and release policy was you released them into the country and you gave them a court date to appear 3-4 months out. Well, the problem was, if you look at the statistics, these migrants were not returning, because if you also look at the statistics, the majority of asylum claims are denied. I think about 71% of asylum claims were denied in the year 2020, and either that was through they couldn't actually claim asylum, or they couldn't prove that they were in any sort of danger from their country of origin. But it did stem the problem of illegal immigration, because when you send them back to Mexico, it deters people from coming up and making the journey if they know that their asylum claim will be rejected. So in terms of, and you can look at the numbers too, we did have 45-year record low immigration under the Trump administration. And I think if we brought this policy back, it would do a lot to curb the invasion at the southern border, frankly.
Okay, now we will go back to our questions. So our next YAF question for the Aggie Dems. Okay. We're actually going to go to the Dems question for YAF. We're going to go to, how do you feel immigration has impacted American history and society overall?
I think immigration has deeply impacted the U.S. I mean, it's kind of obvious, especially during wartime periods where a lot of the men who were in the workforce were off fighting a war. That's when a lot of immigration also went up. I mean, because we're sending off a lot of the workforce. We're going to need people in the country. Same thing with westward expansion. I mean, the U.S. was putting out ads in Europe advertising free land to Europeans to come here. So I think immigration has always been, a huge part of our country. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that, like, where we were then, we were heavily industrializing. We were moving west, trying to fill all this empty space. Really, the reason in the 1800s we brought so many immigrants from Europe, or they made a push to do that, is because the U.S. would put these immigrants out to push out really the Native Americans, I should say, and because they didn't want to use the resources to actually fight a full-scale war against Native Americans here, so they kind of sent out these immigrants to do that. And so now we have no huge need for there's no demand, I would say, for immigrants, but there's always demand for workers. I mean, in any economy, there's demand for workers. So I think immigration is good. I think the more people who can move across the board to work is better for our economy and Mexico's economy. I think anyone who says that doesn't really understand the economy. But I do think it should be monitored to at least so you make sure that if there are criminals who are coming across or national security threats, that those are monitored and stopped.
We will now allow the Aggie Dems to give their rebuttal.
I think this might be the first time in Aggie Dems and YF history where we just completely agree on everything. But track a metaphor with me for a second, okay? So apples come from Asia, but they're not native to the United States. They came across on shipping lanes and trading routes, and when they came to the United States, we quickly integrated into our culture. So basically what I'm saying is immigration is as American as apple pie is. So, when we talk about immigration and when we have to discuss, national security, which is a very important part of immigration policy as a whole, we have to understand that our country was founded on the basis of immigration. Our founders were immigrants. They came here, trying to get away from religious intolerance. The Anglicans. We had cultural divestment. Hey man, I was raised Catholic. That's really important to remember. I'm still Catholic. That's still important to remember. And if we forget that as a country, then we're going to deal with some very awful, demographic shifts. Especially if we have, if we didn't have immigrants, I believe we wouldn't be able to replace our population. Yeah, that's the issue. That's not good. We don't want to be Japan. We don't want to be Poland. We don't want these issues that we're facing in European and Asian countries. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just gonna add something. And I think one thing that we could talk on too, I think y'all mentioned in a previous response, you called the inflow of migrants like an invasion. So I think that's a good thing to kind of touch on, just because it kind of seems like that idea, and also the idea y'all brought up about immigrants being economically necessary, which they are. They fill a lot of low-wage jobs that some Americans, according to polling data, just claim they don't want to take. As we kind of mentioned, they also help support population growth, which is good to avoid issues like other countries are facing. So how do we square this idea that y'all kind of brought up about an invasion? Do y'all think it's like an invasion of some sort, or I guess what are y'all's stances on that?
We will now give Yav a chance to respond.
So, I don't know what your name is again. I'll answer your part, and then Houston will answer yours. As far as like, America's like founding, kind of like who it is immigration, I agree. I think that like immigration is necessary also for like the long-term demographic success of the country. I actually think the country should grow in the long term. I think the main concern tourists have is not necessarily immigration per se, but the rate at which it happens. It's more concern for social cohesion, integration of the immigrants into the broader America. I think when it happens too fast, the kind of the main concern is particularly should create these kind of enclaves that basically don't integrate further in. Obviously, some of that just takes time, but I think just the rate that we're seeing now is also just making people uneasy. And I think especially in like border states, you feel it more immediately. It's one of the things I think that kind of the busing of migrants that Abbott has done, while controversial, has been good to at least show the country this is kind of what the South is feeling as far as the really rapid change in demographic, really rapid change in culture. And that change isn't necessarily bad, but the speed at which it happens, the speed at which it happens to the people that have already been living there is important. I mean, we also have a right here to dictate, kind of what our culture and our society says. So I think it's more of a concern about the speed rather than even the overall immigration.
So you mentioned the Japanese immigrants and how well we integrated them. Well, here's the problem. A lot of migrants that are coming over are not integrating, are not assimilating into society. I personally know many, I personally know people that come over and have been living in the States for 20 plus years, and they refuse to learn English, refuse to learn a single word in English, and it's really hard to communicate with them. You have these massive caravans coming over from Central America waving their flags. It's as if they come and want to stamp their culture, replace everything, don't want to assimilate whatsoever, and just be a plant essentially in Texas and or all of the United States. So that's one aspect. I also wanted to address the invasion part. I like to be precise with definitions of words. So pull up the definition of invasion. It doesn't necessarily mean an armed force, but it can also mean an incursion by a large number of people or things into a place or sphere of activity. So this is what I mean. It's just an unsustainable amount of migrants, and yes, not all of them are bad people, but as we have seen in statistics, we are catching people on the FBI's terrorist watch list, and this has been increasing over the past few years. So I think it's rightful to call it an invasion, and this is the basis for Texas's SB4 law, as I'm sure we'll talk about a little later. So enough for me.
We are now going to offer a 2-minute rebuttal.
Yeah, so a couple of things I wanted to mention with that. Houston, do you know what the official language of the United States is? Right?
We don't have
We don't have one, right? And, although, I guess, most people speak English and it would be great, and a lot of these people will learn English. One fact we wanted to pull up is that this is the greatest English proficiency, wow, that was a nice pronunciation of the word, in immigrants since at least the 1980s. 57% of immigrants speak only English or know English actually very well. And another thing too about assimilation, which I get with the fast, we don't want, millions of people coming in at once. I get that being a concern. And although the United States also doesn't have an official religion, the most dominant religion in the U.S. is Christian, and 83% of these immigrants are Christian, which makes sense. A lot of the countries they are coming from are Christian-dominated countries. And with these assimilation, this concern about assimilation, I think the best way for us to go about this and to make sure that this is, that these people are able to assimilate is the path to citizenship. The policies, the overwhelm we have right now in the immigration system is a problem. We don't let these people know if they're going to be citizens. They're having to wait forever to know if they're even going to get a card or have a place to live and work. And so I think the biggest concern that we have, right now is if we had this process sped up, if we had a lot more funding in this process, that could address a lot of the concerns you're talking about instead of just turning these people away.
Yeah, how much time do we have?
30 seconds.
30 seconds, cool. The only thing I want to say is, I don't think America really has a very cohesive culture. I would say that one of the beautiful things about this country is that we're kind of a knitted patchwork fabric that comes together, and we get to have this beautiful display of different cultures. My parents are from Sri Lanka. Came here. I wouldn't really say that we've assimilated as much as we've added our patch to the American fabric, and that's beautiful. That's part of our country, and I don't think that as an individual or as a group, we need immigrants to assimilate. Rather, the cultural melting pot exists unto itself.
All right, for this next question, each side is only going to have one turn to respond, and it's going to, but it's on the same topic, and it'll keep the discussion going. So we're going to ask Aggie Dems this time. Does cultural cohesion and integration into broader American society matter?
I guess we kind of just touched on this. Personally, I don't think it matters that much to me, just because I don't really see, just looking at American history, there's not really a single American culture that you can define, kind of like what Sashan touched on. I do think it's good for them to have some shared values, which I think most of them do. Things like the belief in democracy, I think, is a pretty big one. It's been pretty constant throughout our history. But really, other than things like that, if they want to work, they want to be involved in the economy, they want to participate in our electoral systems once they become citizens, I think that's great too. But it's hard for me to say that it matters for them to be perfectly integrated to society, just because, like I said, I don't think there's any one single cohesive cultural unit that defines all of America. We're kind of just a melting pot. So
just give me one cultural construct that migrants ought to follow, and I'll give you an American story that rejects those principles outright every time, no matter what you give me, other than maybe common law that we have all to follow. I really don't think that there's such a thing that exists.
We will now go to
My main concern for cultural cohesion is not necessarily what do you eat, what do you look like. It's more about the broader American regime. I'm a big fan of kind of Lincoln's understanding of the Constitution is the frame, the Declaration of Independence, the Apple. These are kind of core founding understandings of our polity and our republic. With the current attacks on our institutions, this kind of thing that we're systemically racist, that we're a systemically evil country, that America needs to be we need to rebuild a new America completely different than we've had. And I'm not saying that y'all believe that. I'm just saying this is kind of these attacks on our institutions. I increasingly feel that there's nothing that links us because we're not ethnically or culturally homogenous people other than that. And so that's kind of the institution that I really see as kind of the unifier. And integration into and loyalty to kind of that republic and that regime is important, personally. And I think also language is important. I know that there's no official language, but I think that having a common language, whatever it is, it could be English, it could be Spanish, it humanizes us more, we see people more eye to eye, just because there's no kind of barrier between us. Personally, when I've engaged people that we don't speak well as English, it's hard for me to understand them quite as well, be as empathetic, personally. And also Houston wants that.
So Kevin, going back to what you said, yes, there is no official language in the U.S. There are a few countries that don't have an official language, such as Mexico, in case you know that. But what's funny to me is that a lot of wealthy people from America, a lot of wealthy Americans will go and actually live in Mexico City. And there's videos out there of locals complaining that these wealthy Americans are not speaking Spanish; they're just speaking English. What would you say to those that go and live they're trying to start a life, not start a life, but live the rest of their lives in Mexico? It's obvious to me. Of course, you sit down and you try to learn Spanish because there's people that do not speak English. The majority doesn't. When you're talking to the older age group, so that's one thing I would say. Also, languages. President touched on, it's one of the few things that unites us. I mean, when you go abroad, say you go to like China, when you find that one person that speaks English, they could be from Pakistan, and I could not care less. I mean, this person speaks the same language, we can communicate, we can exchange ideas, and I think that's beautiful, and I think that's why we should really emphasize the learning of English, because once you do that, you can have cultural cohesion in a society.
All right, now we're going to talk about the issue close at home. The question's going to be it goes, what are your opinions on Texas' recent Senate Bill 4?
So as before, for those of you that don't know, this gives the ability for law enforcement in Texas to arrest migrants for crossing the border illegally and charge them with, I believe, a second-degree felony, if I'm not mistaken. I think I'm in favor of this law. It's a measure that we can use to further deter immigration. Opponents would like to say that this will induce targeting, and I fail to see that this. I believe this law is in place now, and I fail to see how you're driving down, say, Wellborn, and there's just a mass row of people, of Mexicans getting stopped, or Mexican Americans getting stopped because they were racially profiled. I think that's false. If you actually look at the statistics, America has one of the lowest racial consciousness or racial consciousness has been decreasing. So race is not a factor in it. I think that's just really a horn to toot that has really no basis. But I think the law is great in its nature, and I'd like to hear what issues we have with it.
Aggie Dems?
Yeah, sure. Look, I do appreciate what you're saying. I think there's some genuine points that agree with there. The only thing I would say is if we're driving down Wellborn, it's not Kevin that's going to be stopped. And the trouble is that while our racial consciousness is going down, I agree. I've seen the statistic. It's true. It's still pretty high, and in contention with other countries that are comparable to us, and by comparable I mean that they are developed countries that are also within the third stage of the IDE. Like we're, in comparison to places like Canada, in comparison to places like the UK, we're either comparable or much lower, and that's a problem when we allow law enforcement to essentially racially profile individuals to determine their status. There are illegal immigrants that come from other countries, but those immigrants are not going to be the ones that are stopped, profiled, and told to go back home.
I guess the other thing, and this might just be me being like a nerd, but the other problem I have with it is that I think it's very likely to be unconstitutional. Obviously, we're still waiting on the Supreme Court ruling. They ruled that I think they didn't put a hold on it or anything like that, so that's why it's in effect, but it is still in litigation. Just because there are issues with when state and federal governments have laws that interact with each other. Usually it's the federal government. It's always been the federal government that has superseded the state's law. We saw that recently with Arizona v. United States. That was in, I think, 2012. That's kind of the problem I have with it too, and I know we could open that discussion up to sanctuary cities as well if y'all want, because I think they kind of fall into the same niche where they're not as explicit in trying to bypass federal law, but they do use some loopholes to do that. And I think both of those things are just kind of evidence of the broader issue, which is that the immigration system is not working because it's not funded enough, because it doesn't have enough judges, because it doesn't have the support it needs to process the migrants, which just results in states or cities and stuff like that trying to choose their own kind of ways to address it in ways that frankly aren't constitutional. So.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, I think the last time with that, Houston just kind of came up when you were mentioning like, people being like arrested on Melbourne, and it's not really the officer's job to, I get pulled over or someone gets stopped for them to also be thinking about your, are you an immigrant or are you an undocumented immigrant? Something with that, they're usually looking at your license, looking at whenever you stop. Is that another thing that a state or county or city, I guess, any form of like a local police officer should also be checking whenever they stop you or whenever anything happens, I guess? Is that their job, or is that more of what the federal government should be doing?
So we are going to go into kind of a mix of the federal government as well as the state government with this question for the Dems. Joe Biden's indifference on the issue of the border has resulted in Governor Abbott taking extreme measures. Democrats have often flaunted federal authority when it comes to immigration issues, notably with sanctuary cities. Why then is it any different when conservative governors flaunt federal authority on the border?
I mean, I think the first thing, and I guess this is probably a more like recent thing that happened like in the last few months with the like Democrat indifference, is that a bill was attempted to get passed through the House, and it was stopped by the former president, essentially calling Republican members of Congress and ordering them to stop the bill. And regardless if you agreed with every single aspect of that bill and the different things that it allotted for, it was going to improve the current situation at the border. It was going to improve a lot of the points that you have and a lot of the things you want to see change at the border right now, and that was stopped by a former Republican president. So the Democrats have put measures forward to try and solve the border crisis, and it has been stopped by Republicans who are, obviously the ones most calling for this to be changed.
I guess, yeah, and with that too, I want to point out that the main writer of that bill is actually Republican Senator James Langford. He's from Oklahoma, and he was not very happy with the fact that it got blocked. So I do think, and to that point too, I do think that that bill was not perfect. I think Republicans would agree that that bill was not perfect. Democrats would agree it wasn't perfect, but it was something. It was a compromise, and it was pretty unfortunate to see that get derailed. And then I guess jumping over to the sanctuary cities discussion, just because it was brought up, like I mentioned, they basically use this loophole where if someone is arrested or if someone is arrested by someone in the sanctuary city, then usually they would be required to report them to ICE if they were an undocumented immigrant. But basically, the city puts into place laws that say, no, you actually don't have to do that because of the Fourth Amendment. You have to say that ICE has to get a warrant for that, and it just basically creates loopholes. And like I said, just the main thing is that it's a product of the broader issue. It's a way to try to, not even try to solve the issue, but just kind of try to get around what's going on instead of actually addressing the solutions. And I guess some other things with sanctuary cities I just want to bring up, because when I was researching for this, I found these pretty interesting. There's no association with higher crime in sanctuary cities, which is really interesting because I feel like there's a lot of talk around the immigration debate about immigrants being criminals or bringing in crime. There's no higher association of crime. In fact, immigrants are less likely than American-born people to commit violent crimes or to commit crimes in general. And also enforcing immigration laws, which is what sanctuary cities try to avoid, is they avoid enforcing the immigration laws, also doesn't have a higher impact on the crime rate or anything like that. So I just think that's really interesting. So yeah.
Yeah, and now's your chance to respond. I mean, as far as, so let me actually address the bill issue first. I mean, I'm kind of, I don't know about these two, but I'm more in favor of compromises. I mean, so I don't know about the bill in particular, so I can't say if I probably agree to it or not. But I mean, if it was a decent compromise, I think probably one of Trump's kind of errors in his kind of last year of presidency, he's kind of more blockading those things. So I mean, I think we do need reform, and I think some compromises that have to happen just to kind of make it more amenable to both the left and right-leaning states. As far as sanctuary cities go, as far as disregarding the issues on the crime rates, as far as the federal flaunt, you mentioned like this kind of loophole, kind of using the Fourth Amendment, particularly right to privacy. I mean, I think Abbott's whole argument is kind of the same thing. You know, we're using Article 4 to justify, it's an invasion, as Houston kind of said, it's kind of an encroachment on Texas's territory, its own sovereignty. that's kind of my issue is, do I think that what Abbott's doing is great, like kind of flaunching federal authority? No. Actually, I'm not a big fan of it. I'm also not a big fan of the left-wing states also kind of flaunching it. I think any kind of compromise in the reality has to get both the states back under one single federal umbrella. That means the Democratic states have to stop doing these kind of policies that flaunt them, especially when there's a Republican president that is more maybe active on immigration. Simultaneously, when a Democratic president is more, maybe reluctant, Republicans also have to be more willing to fight with it. So I think the problem is currently just kind of a breakdown in kind of federal state authority that's exacerbated by both parties not willing to actually come to the table.
In regards to the situation at the border, Title 42 ended. I believe this was sometime last year in May. And then Biden ended the Remain in Mexico policy. And as we saw, those two were devastating to the numbers of migration coming over the border. So I think this whole rhetoric coming from the Biden administration saying Republicans have our hands tied, I really don't believe this, because Biden could easily use some executive orders, although you debate on the legalities, but he can easily use some executive orders to bring some of these policies that stem the flow of migrants over the border.
All right, now Aggie Dem's going to respond.
Just trying to make sure I have my information right. So I think one thing that's interesting, and it's really hard to kind of determine because they were both in place they overlapped at the times they were in place, Title 42 and Remain in Mexico, and it kind of overlapped when they ended too. But I think Title 42, there might be an argument for that having been a more effective measure, because for those who don't know, Title 42 was, I think, put in place by either the CDC or someone involved with the border more directly. It was related to COVID-19. It was basically saying that they were afraid of migrants bringing in COVID-19 to the country, and then it kind of just got left in place after the pandemic had ended. And so basically they just weren't accepting people as much as they were before, again, because they were saying, oh, you might have COVID, so we don't want you in here. And that was actually ended by I think a DC circuit judge or a DC federal judge, something like that, or maybe the Supreme Court or something like that. So that wasn't necessarily a Biden policy to end that. And I just think that could probably explain more of the change in immigration rates, because if you look at numbers, what I saw, it was like 2018 to 2019 were like roughly the same. I can't remember when Remain in Mexico was put into place exactly, but the biggest drop-off is in 2020 and in 2021 when Title 42 was put in place. So I think there might be some more evidence that that was more impactful on the total inflow to the border, and that wasn't necessarily Biden's fault that got ended. That was the judiciary.
And about federal versus state authority, I think we pretty much just completely agree on that. Our issue with Abbott isn't constitutional, it's political. So, about right. You have a political disagreement with sanctuary cities, you have a political disagreement with busing people from Texas to New York or California, and that probably makes sense.
Yeah, we'll have a 1-minute response.
I don't know, you said something, I was going to reply, but then you said, talk about the busing. I think the busing actually is a good thing, because I think it's necessary for the other states to feel the brunt of the immigration coming. I think also it allows the states to share that responsibility, also of integration as well. So you have people going all across the country, integrating into the broader country. I think that's a big kind of part of Abbott's whole, not shtick, but just kind of his impetus and kind of the political fury that we've seen on the right, especially in Texas, is it feels like Texas is the one bearing all the responsibility. All the issues at the border, all of the cultural and demographic upheaval, it's all borne by Texas. And so, I think it's only fair if we are truly the United States. We really want to bring this back to a federal umbrella. We want to take away the kind of state concern. We have to be doing this kind of lesson. We have to be sharing that load of immigration. Otherwise, it really does feel like states are only forced to have to respond to it in their own ways with the rest of the federal.
All right, we're moving on to a new question, and this is directed by the Dems to Yaf. How can Americans avoid the sensationalization of the immigration issue?
The word is sensationalization. It's a spelling bee now.
It's a way better word.
I think, people need to, the immigration issue has it's always been an issue. There's always going to be immigration, there's always going to be disagreements between both sides of how exactly that should get done. I think people should really focus on, there should be focus put on the actual issues that are present in the system instead of I think both Republicans should stop, shouting. I think they are right to, raise issues with the mass amount of numbers coming across, but they should also, in the same breath, raise issues about the current system. And I also think that Democrats should, raise issues with the current system, but also say we have to change it because we're getting swamped in certain states. And along with that, I think that, as far as the House and the Senate, I think there needs to, one of the reasons, for instance, that the bill about the border failed is, there wasn't just a border bill put forward. It was, a whole lot of stuff and then border in there somewhere. I think there needs to be focus. Representatives need to be focused on, writing a bill, having, I like single issue bills. I think that'd be another thing that would, help, the public kind of not get so, pulled one way or the other on it. But that's what I'm saying.
I'd also like to add a few things. In regards to the, I guess the hyper-sensibilization of the issue, I think you should interact with locals. It's easy for me to say because I come from a Hispanic background. But also, I think earlier, I think Kevin, you mentioned, or maybe it was Zach, they mentioned that we don't want another Japan, or we don't want another Poland. Well, I completely disagree. This is not a flex, but I lived in Finland for about 6 months. And let me tell you, Finland is very restrictive on their immigration. They've actually been strengthening or making it more restrictive to gain citizenship in Finland. And I see why. When you live there, the thought of living there was just foreign to me as a Texan. But when I went over there, I saw how well society was put together. I saw the cleanliness of society. And I asked myself, I started asking questions, why is Finland not in a state of deterioration such as Sweden? You see the consequences of immigration in Sweden, where immigrants are from, particularly Syria, from the Syrian civil war. They're 9 times more dependent on welfare. And we just don't see that in Finland because Finland is much more restrictive. And then in regards to Japan, everyone wants to go to Japan. It's just, I think you can make the argument that maybe Japan, does tend to show a little racism towards foreigners. But everyone wants to visit because it's such a beautiful country. And I don't think you can, I think there's something to be analyzed in that and why these certain countries that are restrictive in immigration are so appealing.
I think this kind of touches upon the whole crux of diversity versus homogeneity, and the benefits of both. Because there are benefits of both. I don't think that's wrong to say. It's trying to find a striking middle ground. I think is kind of the issue with immigration all the times. You want the best of both worlds. You want a homogeneous society, but you also want a diverse society. What's the best way to reach that? Slower, faster, those kind of things.
You're going to offer the Dems a 2-minute rebuttal.
I think the first thing, Houston, something you said, just real quick, I wanted to point out is that, you said these refugees, that was actually the point I was going to get to, is the migrants in Sweden are from Syria and that they're on welfare. The reason is that they're refugees. And that is a lot of the reason that these European countries, and I think it was, I'm not sure if it was the EU as a whole, but a lot of them started accepting refugees from Syria and other countries around there. And while that may be a criticism that you want to bring to any countries that they haven't properly handled, these refugees, and I think that's a big criticism that people bring this week. I'm not totally familiar on that topic, but that's, are you going to say the same consideration about Germany when they've handled those refugees? I don't think you can necessarily generalize Sweden's handling of refugees to all these things. And then the fact that Finland just doesn't, because, for what reason or not does Finland not want to have refugees or immigration in general? It's, those are small Scandinavian countries that, although, Finland obviously has, #1 happiness in the world and all that. It's kind of an ideal, over there. It's a tiny country. How many people?
10 million.
Yeah, 10 million people. So it's 5 million. Oh wow, yeah, half of that. So it's, I'm not sure if that's easy to generalize that something that would work so well for Finland that also doesn't have a border where people are trying to immigrate across to the United States.
Yeah, and like I said, I don't know too much about Finland's, immigration policy, but if they're part of the EU, are they they have free access into the country from other EU bordering countries, right? Because there's freedom of the movement in the EU. So I don't know what their specific policy is to curtail immigration, but I think the biggest thing that makes us different from Finland is that we have 300 something million people, and Finland has, I think it was 5 million or 10 million or something like that. So that's what makes a huge difference in terms of how you craft your society, how you employ the policies. I think, if I remember correctly, I think a lot of those Nordic countries have a lot more government welfare programs, just because, again, it's smaller, so it's easier to set those up and make them work efficiently. See, like I said, I had something else, but I forgot what was more on the original point because I got distracted by that.
If we want to talk about, why Finland is, clean, you use the word clean, and I'd love to talk about that because I love talking about this sort of thing. So Finland has a very robust infrastructure program. They invest a lot of sanitation, they invest in a lot of government programs, and I think that we ought to take maybe some sort of lessons from that, and we can. I think Finland is a hallmark of what a great sort of society can look like if we choose to invest in systems like healthcare, if we choose to invest in larger packages when it comes to they treat their veterans from they have a relatively small veteran population, but they treat them very well. They treat their homelessness is at 0%. Fishery and wildlife is highly invested in. Their best economic sources are highly invested in. They have free trade. They do all these wonderful things that a lot of EU's countries do, and that's probably where you see all this cleanliness and happiness coming from. Probably not the lack of immigration.
I remember my original point, and I think just yes. Okay. I think just to clear up our confusion about Japan, our comment was not that Japan's a bad country or anything like that. It's just that their population is kind of having a crisis where they have a very aging population, which will eventually lead to not enough people to fill workforce and that sort of thing. And that's where immigration can come into play because immigration can fill in that population decline that you might experience with an aging population, which is kind of what's happening here because baby boomers were a lot bigger than other generations since have been. So immigration can fill in that issue and kind of relieve those economic issues that might arise.
Okay, thanks for that. We are going to take a short break right now, just to, it's been a while, regather your thoughts. We are going to have an audience question part of the debate. That's going to be towards the end. But when we come back from break, which is probably in about 5 to 6 minutes, we're going to steer the conversation back to America, because I don't care about Finland or Japan. I'm really told that. Now we're going to steer the conversation back to our country that we love. And all right. And TikTok.
This is where I started.
That guy is here. Yeah, he's also
That's a shame. It'd be really funny if we were pretending not to have it. Zach over here. If you do the classic.
You were always hate TikTok because Biden. That's why.
Look, I don't want Elon Musk has bought Twitter revive their competitor. Elon Musk has revived after.
I don't think Elon Musk has a single directive. I think he does something, he sends it for something, it's actually just.
If they did a rehash line, if the TikTok went probably would have blown up. That would have been happening.
I know, Ryan would have been like.
He's so smart, but he's also so stupid. Well, I would say they should make Logi like a TikTok clone. The name and like the memories.
Don't say anything about issues.
Howdy.
Hi.
We are going to go ahead and get started back on our debate. We just have one more question and then we'll open it up to the audience. So this is for from YAC to the Aggie Dems. Most of the focus on illegal immigration into the United States has been on Latin American immigrants, but increasingly has been the case for people from other countries, such as China, owning 2 TikTok streams. A 60 Minutes documentary showed many to even be middle class. Does this change the local consideration at all?
I don't think so. I mean, like, I guess like our whole argument has kind of been like, it's about funding the systems that are in the border now, and the border that we talked about earlier. I mean, that's kind of just an increase in number of migrants. Honestly, I'm not sure what if that has been measured yet. I know that's been talked about before with people attempting to get through the U.S. border just going by land. I know that's another thing that people said is happening in Canada. I'm not sure if that's like happening there, though. I'm not sure what the numbers are. Though I don't know if it necessarily like changes anything. Obviously, I think they should be able to process the same way. And I think the only thing, and maybe y'all agree with this, that might hold up different at the asylum court. More, that these are people that like they're not going to be fleeing something that maybe look at it differently there. But I'm not sure for that specific situation. We're just saying middle class Chinese citizens coming into the U.S. But otherwise, I'm not exactly sure like where that will fall. Other than a decrease in number, then we need to fund these systems that are currently overwhelmed, so they can actually process those in the first place.
I don't think that country of origin or socioeconomic status really like affects how we process immigrants. And I also like our opposition to illegal immigration doesn't change on any of those aspects. I know we were talking like just before about the 6 weeks interview in the stream, and we don't really. I don't think it's necessary to change the border policy based off of like extreme examples like this. Our border policy as it goes now is overloaded, and when we process these migrants as they come in, we need the infrastructure there so that they can be processed the way that we would like to process them in a safe, orderly, and clear way.
Yeah, your rebuttal.
I would definitely agree that, obviously this whole debate we've been saying that there needs to be reforms, the this whole immigration system and processing needs to be made way more efficient than it is. I would say, however, that I think you're never going to process immigration exactly as fast as there are immigrants coming in. I mean, you're always going to be processing too fast and wasting resources, or you're always going to be processing too slow, and people are coming in when you can handle. But what I would say is, if I'm going to have to err on which side of those do I want to land our error on? I don't want to process people and then turn them loose into the country before we actually have time to vet them. That's why I like the Remain in Mexico policy so well, is because they would come over, but then we'd start processing them, but they couldn't stay in the U.S. Because I don't want the lag time, the error of our system. I don't want if it's going to exist, which it will exist. I don't want to let them be able to cause problems in the U.S. if they are foreign assets or anything. Which I'm not a big fan of a lot of the China rhetoric on the right. But I mean, there is some anti-U.S. sentiment, or a lot of anti-U.S. sentiment, and there's bound to be some China assets who are in the immigration system, and I'd rather them not be told that they can run the country while their asylum cases are being processed.
I think I will mention too, you also talked about just the reform of the courts. I do know that partially the reason why the numbers are so low for China is also because of the lack of visas they're being offered for, particularly workers' visas. So that is partially the issue. I don't know why Biden hasn't upped them, unless it's maybe with some logistical constraints. I think my concern with that why I was wanting to ask that question, to be honest, because one of the refrains about letting lots of immigration into the country, especially as asylum seekers, a lot of it's asylum for poverty, asylum for these countries maybe are civically repressive, but yet China for the most part isn't really like that. And so I wonder if mass migration, if that's as big of a deal or as important, if we can say people really don't need to have to come. That makes sense. They're just really just a desire because they want to. Maybe because of opportunity, but not because they're feeling forced to. I just see that narrative, that bent on the left particularly, is we should allow a lot of immigration in at a moral concern for those coming, because we have so much wealth here.
All right, we'll give both sides one more chance to respond to each other, and then we'll open up the floor.
All right, I do think that there is, while China is not a society that is known for being deeply in poverty, like many of the Central American countries are that people are fleeing from for asylum, there are still some significant political forces which would encourage people to seek asylum here in the United States. The government is still very repressive, as much as it has opened up since Deng Xiaoping took over. And financially, there are a lot of limitations on Chinese people that make them afraid that their property will be at risk if they stay in the country, which is why we do see so many people who come to the United States to buy real estate. It's because it's safer here. We have a stronger economic principles here than China does as far as protecting them. So when people think they're at risk of political violence from the state of China, it doesn't make sense they would want to come here for asylum, because we do see cases of violence. We see people get disappeared in China. We see all sorts of, the camps in Xinjiang for the Uyghurs that are in there. So people who come to the United States from China for asylum, there are a lot of reasons why they would come here that I do think are legitimate reasons to come here. And while there are likely some assets that are being sent from China that are mixed into that, I think that if we expand our infrastructure for processing immigrants, that gives us a lot more control over who we're able to let in as well. If we don't have the infrastructure and they come in illegally, we can't vet them, and we can't decide who we want to let in, who we don't want to let in. Legalize and regulate rather than ban outright is the main thing. So we will have a lot more resources to spend on, okay, who is this person's connections, who are they related to, Do we think they're a Chinese asset, or do we think they are actually someone who is a known fast Chinese citizen who has run afoul of the party, and they actually do have a legitimate reason to come here? And we can only check that if we have ample resources, ample judges, lawyers, courts available to process these cases.
Okay, two quick things. One, the Emergency National Security Supplemental Appropriations Act. From the you were saying, why hasn't Joe Biden just like upped the number of green cards? This does. It's on his desk right now, past the House and the Senate. So we're gonna increase the number of green cards by about 50K. Two, from what you were saying, the too fast. We don't want to make sure we don't process migrants too fast. I want to be like very, very clear about what processing migrants means. If you do it faster, it doesn't mean more people are getting it. Doing it faster means that we're getting through the process of either rejecting or accepting applicants faster than we were before. Now, about foreign assets, yeah, I know we kind of generally agree that foreign assets aren't really something I can super worry about there, but it's still worth addressing because I think it's a fair point. Our system, when it's better funded, when we have the resources that it needs, is more able to root out the kinds of foreign assets that we are trying to make sure don't get into this country. So what seems like the crux of this issue can be solved by allocating more resources towards our failing immigration courts, and through a lot of bills that are, or a bill that is going through Congress that has gone through Congress and is on the desk right now. So we're solving these problems. We're doing our best, and we're trying our hardest to make sure that our friends on the other side of the aisle aren't stopping our progress as it stands.
Yeah, I guess a real quick thing to add on to that, and this may be just like a way we both, like, our organizations kind of look at immigration and like people seeking asylum differently, is that, people coming here through asylum and through, almost any means, we're assuming that they're looking for work here once they get here. And I think, we said we were going to talk about the U.S. and we actually deviated from that pretty fast. But, and I think something Houston mentioned earlier, especially with, like refugees and like Sweden being on welfare, that's not the ideal, right? Like that's not, I don't know why we would support that either. It's just everyone coming in and being on welfare immediately or something. We want people hopefully to come here and then be able to find work, and that would be the ideal. We assume that like everyone that's coming here. Obviously, a lot of people that are seeking asylum, that's probably not the first thing on their mind if they're trying to flee something. Is are they like they're trying to get away from an oppressive regime? But I think that's a general attitude that we have, and maybe we didn't clear before. I don't know if either of us actually said that before, but we assume a lot of people are coming here and they're going to work.
And our final 2-minute response.
Yeah, so in regards to motivations for coming over, he talks to a lot of border agents down in southern Texas. They actually talk to the migrants and they ask them, and a lot of them are coming over for economic reasons, for work, as you mentioned. But here's the thing, they're not investing that money into the United States. I personally know a lot of people that come and work here because they can get a higher salary, get paid more, and then they send it back to Mexico because their entire family's in Mexico. So it's single, these middle-aged men that come over to get paid, not to pay taxes, they get paid on cash, they're not on payroll, and then they just send money back to Mexico. So it's really not really benefiting us in any way. When these people get on these welfare programs, it's just for exploitation a lot of the time. I'm not saying all of them are for exploitation, but they are really a drain on the economy at times. And in regards to China, a lot of those migrants coming over can be foreign assets. And I think this is the broader picture of China's plan to sort of disintegrate America from within. They're facilitating this through fentanyl, through the southern border. I think we haven't touched that yet. It's fentanyl. Fentanyl is the number one drug coming over the United States border, both from the north and the south. But it's killing Americans in mass, and I don't think we're really doing anything to stop it. So that's what I would say. Keep an eye out for China. China has nefarious intentions, even though our intentions might not be, we might not have malintentions.
Okay, thank you. And that concludes our formal debate. And we do want to open it up to the floor. So if you have have a question that you'd like to ask or talk a little bit about your opinion on any of the subjects, you can just come up to the front here and we will give you the mic. Any takers?
Don't be shy.
I have a question for both Houston and I'm sorry for all this person. Houston, you mentioned like agreeing with Bill 4, which basically like makes undocumented immigrants able to face about I think it's felony, second degree felony, if like found out to be undocumented. And I was wondering if you agree that like, you know, children of like undocumented immigrants who are not all these people are born here, but came here when they were younger and remain undocumented. They grew up here and all they know is America and the English language. Do you think they should also be face the same consequences, like fines of up to like $10,000 and going to prison for, two-time offenders face 20 years in prison, and also like deportation as well. And having that on your record actually like hinders any, like a lot of work opportunities. So would you argue that, you know, treatment of undocumented immigrants who are illegally assimilating to American culture should be able to face the same consequences?
Thank you for your question. That's a good question. I'm assuming you're referring to migrants that come over here when they're maybe 2 or 3 years old and not in their own volition. They didn't make the choice themselves to come over.
Yeah, it can be 2 or 3 years old as well as
But they weren't born. Yeah, they're not Americans.
Talking about someone born in Mexico, brought over when they're young, and you know they don't speak Spanish, they don't know anything about Mexico. That is a tough question because I think we need to, you know, if a case come up like that, we do that on a case-by-case basis. Yes, it's unfortunate. You know, they didn't voluntarily evade law enforcement by crossing over the border. So I would just look at this on a case-by-case basis. I would not advocate for, you know, say a 16-year-old that now only speaks English, you know, or a 19-year-old be charged with a felony because he's in the country illegally if somehow the police found out. But this would be a case-by-case basis. I mean, I can't give you a concrete answer because everyone's case is different.
I mean, it also depends on like, are we deporting these people back to Mexico or whatever country they were originally from? You know, if it's like a small child, like 2 or 3, then it's probably not as big of a leap if they were leaving. We're talking about imprisonment or fine. I think there's questions that like to get a child's raised. You can make exceptions for that maybe, or maybe the penalties could be different. So maybe you still penalize those who are here illegally. Maybe instead of like sending them to prison, or maybe fining them, maybe it's community service. Other things that can be a penalty, that can be a boon to the culture they're from without maybe hurting the child as much. So we do as an organization, yeah, we do care about the children. We don't want to just leave them to try. Go ahead, representative, or just.
Okay. For Preston, on the issue of like busing immigrants, I think there was an article by Red Habit actually sent like 2 buses full of migrants to Kamala Harris's house. I guess to prove a point, do you believe it's ethical, the utilization of like immigrants to prove a point? Isn't that?
That's a good question. Think about that for a second. Is it ethical to use people like that? Is it, in the matter of politics, sometimes a hard choice? I don't like some of the gamesmanship, some of the showmanship. I think it's almost equally unethical, though, that Kamala Harris and much of the Biden administration has been so derelict on this duty. I think Abbott does this because, in order to make a point, in order to make a statement. I don't think it's something that should be done regularly. I don't think it should be done really at all, ideally. But I wouldn't say it's justified. I'm not saying it's a good thing that he did that. But it kind of sounds like Martha's Vineyard, basically. Like, what's Martha's Vineyard? I mean, it's meant to show, like, this is what's coming. Like, you're a politician, you're here to serve us. These are the people that you're supposed to be caring about and concerned about, that you're letting come over. But you don't actually feel the brunt of it. You don't see the people, talk to them, actually have to deal with them on the border day in and day out. And so, I don't like using people. But I think in extreme cases like we are right now with the border, I think it was probably necessary. That said, I don't want to be anyone. I don't like to show and show the process.
Anyone else? All right. We'll get to everyone eventually. We have time.
Great. Thank you. Howdy.
Howdy.
I'm Sam Fernando. I'm a professor here at the Department of Biological and Aggie Engineering. So, I have a radical idea. I need your opinion from actually both sides of the aisle.
I'm in. By the way, this is my dad. So this reflects very poorly.
Okay, so the primary reason we have immigration here, or the problem with immigration here, is because the immigrants are actually looking for a better life in the US. I mean, there's no other reason. And they come here also to work. They are not coming here to steal. I mean, there could be, one or two in any pack, but primarily to work. And if you're actually thinking about the real economic impact, the biggest economic partners of the US, you might be thinking that it is China. No, it is actually Canada and Mexico. So I have this radical idea. Why not, just like the European Union or the countries in the European Union, we open up the borders. And my argument is that yes, there will be an influx initially, but then things will probably settle down, subside. And then, I'm not saying that it should be totally open, but it should be some sort of a controlled way of allowing people to, come here and work, giving them work permits, but opening up controllably. I would really like your ideas.
You want answers to your dad? Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, Dad. I never thought I saw the day where you'd be more progressive than I am, but we've reached it, and I'm very proud of you. So, here's the issue, right? I appreciate your generally positive stance towards allowing more people into the border on either end. But the problem we're going to face if we just adopt a completely open border policy is that we have genuine adversaries that exist, not necessarily to our northern border, but towards our border. And while the vast majority of immigration that happens into the United States is completely safe and legal and normal, completely open borders is something that would probably increase crime at a rate at which is impossible for any state like Texas or any city like when we have here to be comfortable with, especially taking. I feel like I'm conservative here. I feel like taking jobs away from American workers. I might join y'all, to be honest. Yeah, we just be like, yeah, absolutely. But generally, I agree. I think that when immigrants come to this country, they're coming here because they appreciate American ideals, American values. They're here to work. They're here to become and at the most fundamental level, be an American. And we should encourage that in the ways in which we can. I think open borders is probably a good, your heart is in the right place.
Can you distinguish that? Can you define that? I think if we were to open up the border, it would shift the problem to Mexico and some of these Central American countries. But I would just think it was too fast. It would just be cultural suicide. And I want to maintain some sort of cohesion in society, and I think that's where culture is a big deal.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Do we have any more questions? If you have questions, you can line up here.
Give us questions. Let me see your background.
Hi. So for the devs, the cultural cohesion part. I come from a Salvadorian background. My parents immigrated. My mom escaped the Civil War. My dad as well. Got asylum for raiding. And they're very opposed to immigration. I picked some of that because when we lived in Los Angeles and mostly in the city, in the area part, and we saw that we couldn't go to the Mexican sides because they hated our culture, and then the Mexicans, or we hated the Mexicans because of that. It was just, and then that built on to the African Americans. They hated us because we were taking resources. Like we have to do a good in a very certain way, and then as a Christian, we have our own set of rules, and it's conflicting alongside with. We just really show must go on. My mom works for South Indian, sure. Yeah, but if we can't relate to like holidays or just beliefs in general, there is no society. Because a society is individuals and then families and then towns and then it keeps going up and up. But at the base level is the individual. If I can't relate to you or to you guys, then there is no society. So I think that's where I stand on that.
Sure. I do think that like I think we all have all those things. Yeah.
All right, so that's a good question. I think it's a really great question, actually. I can't relate to you. I don't know anything about your culture. I don't think you know anything about mine. But, you know, I'm actually not a fan of Christopher. I know I'm bad. I'm not sure I'm good for it. But, yeah, I know. They hate me for it. But I don't. And I think what we can relate to each other as is, so though we may not share the same culture, our identity as Americans is still the same. And like you were talking about, where in LA did you live?
I lived in Compton for a bit.
Lived in Compton?
And then we moved to South Central LA.
Yeah, gotcha. So when we exist in these like cultural enclaves where we're completely separated from each other, we can't come to understand each other's cultures, that's where we start to have problems. Where an individual just doesn't understand you, and because they don't understand you, they fear you, and because they fear you, they hate you. I don't think we have to have the same culture for us to get along. I just think I have to understand yours. And the only way for me to actually understand your culture is by talking to you. That's why I think this is really important. And I think that when we do this, when we have these kinds of conversations, when we can start to understand each other's cultures a little bit better, we don't have to assimilate if we can just appreciate. And I appreciate it. Do we need to have a similar language? I mean,
to understand each other?
Sure. So when we have a similar language, that certainly helps the idea of cross-cultural association. But I think the alternative of like us having a similar language, the only way to make this is by having us have like a national language. That brings in a whole host of different problems where you're dealing with what does a national language actually entail in our schooling systems. What does it mean for individuals who have to learn how to speak that language and are much older, don't know how to speak those languages? While I think it's good if we can communicate in these similar arenas, it's not necessary for us to understand each other's cultures, especially because while you may not have an individual and communicate it, there's probably a different person who exists in the same culture who can communicate this to you. If we can build a better understanding of this, we can start to appreciate each other.
A similar language to the other person.
I think this model of cultures having to be talking to each other actively is made a lot more complicated by the situation, especially that you were in Compton, which is that in a lot of these cases it's a consideration of survival. This hatred is coming from you mentioned specifically they're taking our resources, and if we are able to create economic situations which are better for the people who come to this country, we won't have these issues of not understanding each other, not assimilating. It's a lot easier to learn English when you have the time and resources to go to an English second language class. I'm actually certified to teach English as a second language, and it's something that isn't available to everyone, and it's more available to people who have more time, more money, more resources available to them. So if we make resources more available for people who come to this country, they'll be able to integrate, not necessarily assimilate, but integrate a lot better. And they'll be able to communicate with each other, they'll be able to sort of bond on the level of there's solidarity in being a middle-class American. It doesn't matter what your background is, there's still going to be a lot in common. It doesn't matter if you have the same holidays necessarily. There have been many cases where solidarity came from other places aside from language, culture, or religion in history. I mean, you can go back as far as the Romans to see this. There were times where Christians and Jews and all living in the same communities. And they so deeply understood each other. And it's because they came from the same groups of people. They lived together in the same spaces, and they had the same concerns. And they weren't competing for resources as much as they were collaborating with resources. These were, in many cases, Romans, not necessarily people in Israel. Yeah, it varied back and forth as the numbers changed, but there were periods where this was definitely the case. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, yeah, you're saying no, we're good. Better right, okay.
All right, so I'm Canadian, and
Someone's sick. What is
I'm currently a freshman. 2 years ago, I immigrated to the States through kind of laws. And on what you were talking about when I got a question, the borders are probably more open than most otherwise, especially in Canada. Just a bit of backstory is my parents came down into Canada, I had a job promotion offer, and it was essentially you go to the immigration and you say, hey, I have an offer in the States. They go, okay, cool, are you on the list of jobs that we want? Because we lack engineering personnel, and he's engineering related, so he's on the list, and so he was fast-tracked. And within a few months, the paperwork was filed through, his company sent the paperwork through, and he had a visa. I think it was non-resident temporary worker visa, right, to work down here. And the travel back and forth is relatively simple for us, because I think it's under 6 months, we don't require any sort of visa to travel, to visit, to do most things. And if we do, it's often relatively simple for us to get it. Like for me, I need an F1 to work here, to get an work here, to study here. And while most people from countries in Europe and Asia go through long-going processes when we do apply and go to embassies and get long-going interviews, they're often very difficult and scary because if they have any iota that you have different intentions, you get in trouble. For me, it was just required that I come to the States, go to the airport, talk to the person at the airport border, tell them I have the documentation, I have the paperwork. I always specifically about the fact that my parents were already adamant on something. But apart from that, there's a kind of distinction between legal immigration and illegal immigration where legal immigration is often a paperwork process. It's U.S. says we want these kind of workers, we want these jobs, we have these positions and skill sets we want to fill, and so we'll invite them in. And legal immigration is someone saying, I want something from the States, I want to take it from the States, and I'm going to go there forcefully outside of the processes. So I just want to ask, where would you say this stand, that line would be for y'all, where there's certain people we would say immigrate illegally because we don't, not that we don't necessarily want them as people, but they won't add anything to the country. And where would the line be where it's like, we want those people in the country, so we should invite them and they should immigrate legally into the country?
Okay, I think you brought up a few like interesting points. Specifically, the like working like visa process is like a very I don't know if we like really touched on that like earlier. I think we kind of did with like China, talking about it a little bit with like your company like hires you in the U.S. or like they want you to work in the U.S. and that's like a thing that your company does to make sure you can get to the U.S. and that's like I mean that's like kind of a universal thing. Like if you know I worked for a company that was like sort of like the French government last summer, and they had a process. You know, if they wanted you in France, and they had to do a whole thing to get you over to France. And I think that's kind of a universal thing, and not just like maybe like not a uniquely U.S. Like that's not the U.S. legal like way to get into the country. That's just kind of how a visa works. A real working visa is specifically, and I think your distinction with legal and illegal immigration. Like is a little like, I mean, is everyone that illegally immigrates, would you assume that they're not willing to work if we just Americans should probably learn whenever they go abroad, like whether like getting into it. You know, hopefully Ivan's father learns the language there. Maybe doesn't take everything, but yeah, I think that is a pretty good question. Honestly, and also on behalf, so we can get more questions.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, my second one for both of y'all. Y'all, I think you touched on it a little bit, but I was just wondering the perspective from both sides of talking about the decreasing fertility rate in the U.S. And I think y'all said something about like immigrants coming helps boost our population back. So I was just wondering opinions from both sides on that.
Yeah.
Sure.
Oh wow. This is definitely not.
Yes, since this is kind of a free-for-all now. I do think that we can totally solve the population crisis that we're having, and I think most of us from our generation are like, oh, we're never going to see Social Security because we don't have the population to replace it. But I think that is a major issue that has kind of been enforced from Big Pharma and everything like that is causing decreasing fertility in both men and women. We're eating these high plant-based diets that are not supporting our protein. And if you're vegan, that's totally fine. But if you're you have to do it properly. And it's just kind of more of a fad, eat the crickets, eat the bugs, sort of deal. And of course, we're in these super high stress situations all the time. We're in hustle culture. And that takes a toll on fertility as well from both the men and women's side. So I do think it's just something that, for whatever reason, Americans don't find value in family anymore. And I think that we really need to bring that back.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I was just going to say there's just a general de-emphasis on like the family structure. You see this being pushed in hustle culture. Put your career at the forefront above anything else. That's what's fulfilling. A job promotion is more fulfilling than staying home with your kids and really coming home to kids. People would rather have a dog than a child, which is quite sad, honestly. So I think we need to. Japan's also like facing a birth crisis where not enough people are being born to replace the population, and I think that's also like a neglect of the family structure and a general emphasis on suicide rates through the roof there, and that's because of the work culture and the culture that these kids are inculcated with. So I think that needs to change. That's pretty much it.
All right, I'm gonna give you guys 30 seconds. I'm gonna go home.
You're in our order. You're in our order.
Yeah, get out of here. I'll go do some finances.
Yeah, I think. We actually tried to talk about that last maybe should have done that. But with the family structure in America, immigration is a tool a lot of countries are really using to like help that population decline, and whatever the reason may be. You could call it like a temporary fix. I think immigration just in general is a good thing for the population. Obviously, hopefully we don't have a rapid population growth and make a lot of things unstable. I think for and this may be more of a rebuttal to them. Like I think a lot of people see these like the systems that their kids are going into here, and that is like discouraging to them to have a kid. Like we all went through public school, unless you went to private, but not calling anyone out. You went to private?
No, I went to public.
I was about to kick you out. I think that's like a general reason. Just one of the many reasons I think that that those birth rates have been under decline. Thank you. It's not the same for a lot of countries. Obviously, I think ideally we wouldn't want to be replacing, no one here has kids and every single person is like from out of the country. That's not sustainable either, right? We should have a general population growth.
Real quick, I think everything you guys are saying kind of supports maybe what we're saying. Like, if it is the case that we're having declining population because people don't have what you guys call the family values, we probably need to support that somewhere. And immigration is, I think, a really great source of population growth and something that we need to seriously consider as if not just a stopgap solution, a solution to the problem in general.
I will respond to that.
Okay, cool. This is not a debate anymore.
I'm breaking my moderation right now. No, but, okay, the whole family crisis, it honestly depends on what your opinion, what you value at the very end of the day. Some people like to get educated, you know, it goes down the history, they get a nice little statue of themselves, they die, big whoop, good for them. Going to Houston's point where, you know, sometimes like bigger, like family values with more emphasis on kid is like a sad thing, not necessarily, because there's some people that take a lot of enjoyment, you know, sometimes they can't even have kids. Or, you know, like, you know, Reagan says, sometimes it's infertile, whatever. It really depends. I know as the country develops,